Are you a Jackie or a Marilyn? Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. So there's been a lot of buzz in the news about Kennedys, the Kennedy family, people talking about releasing the JFK files, will they, won't they, all this kind of stuff. So I decided to do a little bit of research into the Kennedys, particularly JFK and Jackie Kennedy and like their relationship. I watched a few documentaries particularly about Jackie Kennedy, and honestly a lot of these documentaries, like some of them did say conflicting things, but there were some common themes in a lot of these documentaries about Jackie Kennedy that I kind of wanted to touch upon because I think there's some important lessons that we can learn. So before I get into this video, my usual disclaimer, first of all, I don't know anybody in any of these videos. Obviously, JFK was assassinated before I was even born. So I don't know anybody personally in these videos. I am from Massachusetts, which, you know, I feel like everybody from Massachusetts thinks that they're somehow connected to the Kennedys in some way, good or bad. But the reality is I don't know anybody in these videos, and I'm literally just basing all of my analysis and observations and things based on public persona. So I don't know what anybody was like behind closed doors or what the truth was behind closed doors. I mean, I know there's a lot of conspiracies around the Kennedys and stuff. And honestly, like what I'm going to talk about in this video isn't even really about them. It's actually just about the lessons that we can learn from some of these public figures and the lessons we can take into our own lives so we can have happier, healthier lives and relationships. So really this is just a jumping off point to talk about some different topics. And I mean, you could probably do like a whole multi-part series on the Kennedys and JFK and Jackie and the whole thing, but there were just a few common themes in the JFK-Jackie relationship that I kind of wanted to touch on because I think they're really important lessons, particularly for women to learn. One of the big themes that I noticed throughout all of the documentaries I watched about Jackie Kennedy was she had a very complicated relationship with her father, and her father was a philanderer. He slept around, he cheated on her mom, they ended up divorced, which back in that time period, especially because they were Catholic and also because divorce was much less common and because of their sort of status in society, the divorce was very scandalous and it did really affect Jackie very deeply. And there's a lot of indications that she really kind of sided with her dad. She had a complicated relationship with her mom. I think that's really significant because I think we all know that JFK was not exactly faithful to Jackie. And I want to point this out because it's actually not that uncommon for a woman who has a father who fooled around on her mother to then end up in a relationship with a man who cheats. We tend to repeat the generational patterns. And some would say that this was very normalized in society, particularly in upper class society, and there probably is some tie to the fact that in certain societies and certain environments, particularly in politics, I would say in Hollywood as well, marriages are arranged, so to speak. They're really more for some kind of, you know, political or PR benefit, so that people aren't really marrying the person that they actually want to be with. They're marrying the person that is going to benefit them the most. And I'm going to kind of get into that a little bit later in the video, but I just kind of want to touch on the fact that yes, there could be something to that people are like, hey, we're gonna get married, but we don't really want to be together, and so you can do your thing and you can do your thing and we're just together in marriage alone. And in which case, if that's the arrangement, then I guess that wouldn't necessarily be called cheating because it's just two people that aren't really committed to each other in a marriage. They're just in a marriage of convenience, so to speak. I wouldn't recommend it for anybody, but it's probably a lot more common. I think it also gets a little tricky when like only one person realizes that it's a arranged marriage or that this is just a political relationship, and they may think that it's actually a real relationship and the other person is like only in it for convenience and stuff. I think that's where it starts to get into like a messy situation. But I do think this is a really important message because a lot of women believe that having high standards or expecting a lot from a man or keeping their standards high when they're choosing a man, oftentimes women get told that's selfish and that it's very selfish of her to have these high expectations for a man. But I want to make it very clear, if you have high standards for a man, it is not selfish. It's actually not even just for you. Having very high standards for a man in a relationship is actually unselfish because you're not just doing it for you, you're also doing it for your future children, if you are sleeping with this man, so there is the potential of having a child with him. It's also important, I mean, if you already have kids, then obviously your current children, it's important. And honestly, I just think in general, having high standards and having a healthy relationship with somebody is important, even if you aren't gonna have kids, because healthy relationships really are, they're contagious. Like they literally are a representation for other people to know what's possible as far as having a healthy relationship. So you're gonna influence people in the world in general. So for women, having high standards for men is actually important on so many different levels. Like I always say for women, like you want to pick a man that, like, if you had a son, you would want your son to grow up to be like that man. And you also want to marry a man that if you have a daughter, that's the type of man that you would want her to be with. Who you choose is a representation for your kids. You could tell your kids all day, like, don't be like this or be like that, or don't be like your father or something like that. But generally speaking, kids are going to model actions. They're not just going to listen to words. That's why it is so vital for women to have high standards for men. And oftentimes women get told their standards are unrealistic. They get told their standards are selfish and things, and they're not. They're actually vital. And when you look at a situation like a Jackie Kennedy, who had a father who was a philanderer, and then she ended up in a marriage with somebody who was a philanderer. And I would say most of the documentaries I watched basically kind of agree that Jackie pretty much knew what was going on, and she kind of looked the other way because she just felt like it was part of the territory. And she probably thought that because that's what she saw her father do, and he modeled that behavior as being normal. Oftentimes as women, when we witness our fathers or other men that are close to us in society, we tend to normalize their behavior even if it's bad behavior. It was actually a controversy, and I wasn't even going to touch on this, but I did a video a while back about Pearl and some of the hypocrisies that I think Pearl displays. If you're not familiar with who I'm talking about, I mean just Pearly things. And she apparently recently, it was brought to my attention, did a response video. I thought that I was very kind in my analysis of her. She was not so kind to me, which is, you know, goes with her brand, so it is what it is. But in the video, I point out that she doesn't seem to have very high standards for men because she's made it very clear she's okay with a man cheating on her, which is something that she has been very clear about. Her response to that in the video that she made reacting to my video was basically acting like what I said was crazy, and then proceeding to say, oh, well, you mean to tell me that if you have kids with a man and he cheats on you, you're just gonna leave him and be a single mother? Like, good luck with that. Like, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what she said. So essentially she's confirming that yes, she is okay with a man cheating on her. So what I said was not inaccurate. She is saying that that's something that she would be okay with. And, you know, look, if you are in a relationship with a man, depending on where the stages are, you are in a relationship, if you have kids with him, if you don't, if you're married, if you're not, your decision on how to handle infidelity in a relationship is your choice. I would never judge someone for saying that they would leave someone who was unfaithful to them, because that's what I would do. I would never stay with somebody who was unfaithful, ever. Complete deal breaker. Because for me, once trust is broken, I'm done. Like, there's no point in being in a relationship with somebody if trust is broken. And that would be my choice. If that's not your choice, it's your decision. So I wouldn't sit here and tell you what your decision would have to be, because I'm not you. If you told me you were gonna leave, I would totally understand it regardless of the circumstances. I will admit, if you told me you were gonna stay if somebody was unfaithful, I mean, I would wish you well. Wouldn't advise it, but like, it's your choice, because I also know that people aren't going to leave a relationship until they're ready to leave. So it's your decision. But I will say that if you're a woman who is choosing to stay in a relationship with a man who's cheating on you just because you have children, you are literally telling your children that fidelity in a relationship is optional. It's not something to value. And I understand that people have a value of staying together for the children or staying together for the kids. But if you keep tolerating behavior like infidelity in a relationship, you're literally telling your kids, even if you physically say to your kids that cheating in a marriage is wrong, if they witness you accepting infidelity from their parent in your marriage, you're basically telling your kids that infidelity is acceptable. So you're gonna have kids that are gonna grow up and they're gonna find monogamy or fidelity or anything just like an optional thing in relationships. Or they're going to accept that behavior in a partner because that's what they've been modeled. That's what's become normal for them. When we're talking about standards, particularly in this case, we're talking about cheating and infidelity, this is not just about how it makes you feel. It's about making the decision about what behavior you want to model for your children, because it's very likely that your children are going to grow up and model that behavior. If they don't, it's probably because they're going to do a lot of work on themselves to try to break the patterns that they learned when they grew up in childhood, which is a difficult path for anybody to have to do. If you're currently someone who's doing that, more power to you. And in that case, we're talking about actual like infidelity, like somebody who's actually going around and sleeping around, having mistresses and things like that. So I'm going to get into kind of like the wife mistress situation in a minute. But this is also something that shows up in women who choose men who have no sexual discipline. And this can be not even with them like sleeping around, but men who have porn addictions, men who have wandering eyes, who are always checking out other women and stuff. There are some women who make the argument that like, oh, I don't care if he checks out other women, or I don't care if he watches porn, I don't care if he goes to strip clubs, like I don't care about any of that kind of stuff because like I'm not insecure. There's women that will say that. Well, look, I don't buy that. I don't buy it at all. But like, you know, maybe you're just justifying it and maybe it doesn't bother you, whatever. If that's what you're telling yourself and that's what you want to believe, that's fine. However, you know who is going to care? Your future daughters. I can tell you, as someone who grew up in a household with a father who had a severe wandering eye and was very vocal about it, and a mother who acted like she didn't care, it will mess with your head. It can affect daughters in ways that you can't even imagine. In fact, I would even go so far as to say it was the root cause of a lot of my eating disorders. It was a root cause of most of my insecurity. I think you could probably tie it back to pretty much almost every negative behavior that I've ever had in my life. And I'm not using this as a deflection of accountability because I realize that those are my things that I have to heal, but it also was the root cause of that behavior. Because when you have a male role model in your life that is constantly looking at other women, that is constantly commenting on other women's bodies, or judging whether a woman is like sexual or not sexual or that kind of thing, like it really, as a young girl especially, it puts you in so much self-comparison and it really does mess with your head. Like it is so painful as a young girl to experience that. And I know there are some women out there who can pretend it doesn't bother them. I don't buy it. I don't. Like if you're a woman who's like, I don't care, I'm not insecure, I am 1000% convinced if you're a woman who like doesn't care if your man checks out other women, who doesn't care if your man watches porn, who doesn't care if your man goes to strip clubs, doesn't care about that kind of stuff, you either are in denial or you don't really care about that man. Because no woman who actually cares about the man that she's with would be able to handle a man doing that to her. If a woman truly loves a man, honestly, him even looking in another woman's direction and like acknowledging another woman's existence is going to actually create physical pain in a woman's body. When a woman actually loves a man, the idea of him literally even glancing at another woman is going to be painful for her. Now, granted, I realize we live in a world where there are other people and we have to exist with other people, but like that pain is still going to exist. Now, obviously, if it's just a glance or it's just an acknowledgement or something, just because it's another human in the room, that's one thing. But if a man is actually showing interest in another woman, and I have other videos going into this much deeper on a primal level, it literally signals to a woman that she's unsafe. Because historically, women have not been able to survive without their male partner. We don't live in that world right now, but like if we went back to primitive times, women generally speaking would need to partner with a man in order to keep her and her family safe. So if a man shows an interest in another woman, the possibility of him leaving and keeping another family safe and not her and her family safe is actually a threat to her survival. So even though we don't actually live in that world right now as women, most women can survive without having a man in their life. Whether you want to be with a man or be in a relationship or not, most of us are capable of surviving without one. So a man leaving us is not necessarily like a death sentence, but on a primal level, most women believe that if their man, their partner, leaves them, there's a primitive part of us that's like, oh, I'm now unprotected from the world, so now I might not be safe and my family might not be safe. It's a primal thing, like it's a primitive response, but it's still there. So like another woman actually potentially showing up and being a threat to your relationship is actually, for many women on a primal level, a threat to your life and your survival. And again, that's not our current reality in society, but this is like on a primitive level. It's a very primal thing, which is oftentimes why we tend to blame the other woman and not blame the man. Because if we blame the man and we see him as the problem, it's harder for us to stay with him. And if we're in our head thinking that this man is responsible for our survival, we have to convince ourselves that it's not him, it's the other woman, when it's always him. It's always the man, it's always his fault. Like, it's not another woman's responsibility to like protect your relationship or cover up or, you know, not exist in the world so that your man will stay faithful. If another woman existing and just like owning her beauty or owning her sexuality is a threat to your relationship, you've got a bigger problem in your relationship. But a man with no sexual discipline, even if he's not sleeping around but he just has a wandering eye or he's watching porn or things like that, children are going to see that behavior, and especially your daughters. It's going to normalize that behavior, but it's also going to cause so much pain and destruction. It's going to oftentimes put daughters in a sense of self-comparison. I firmly believe that that is the root of a lot of pick-me behavior. Young girls who had fathers who basically acted in a way that these girls felt like they had to compete for their father's attention because their father's attention was always scattered on so many different women. So these young girls believed that it was a woman's job to compete with other women for a man's approval or a man's validation. Like, I think that's at the root of most pick-me behavior. I know a lot of people like to blame mothers for pick-me behavior, and I'm not saying that that can't be a factor, but more often than not, it's the father that sets the tone for pick-me behavior. I actually have a book, the Recovering Pick-Me Girl Guided Journal, that actually has a lot of journal prompts for both mother wounds and father wounds when it comes to pick-me behavior. So I highly suggest you check that out. The link is in the description box. It's so important for women. Like, even if you can convince yourself that like you don't mind this man's bad behavior, that bad behavior is going to affect your kids. Your sons are going to think that that bad behavior is normal, and your daughters are going to think that that bad behavior is normal in men. That's why having high standards and holding a man to those standards is so important when you're in a relationship. I mean, hopefully these are things that, you know, couples, if you are married, you have kids, that you can work through. But you just keep brushing these things under the rug, or you just keep tolerating these things, it's gonna end up causing a lot of problems for your kids in the long run. You can't have a conversation about JFK and Jackie without also talking about Marilyn Monroe. And I know that the Marilyn Monroe stuff, as much as it's known that JFK was having affairs, he was fooling around, many people believe he was having an affair with Marilyn Monroe. I do know that that is still very up in the air as far as whether there's actual evidence of this or if there isn't. I mean, there's a lot of theories and story, and obviously like the Kennedys, particularly JFK, has a whole lot of conspiracies that surround him and his whole situation. So whether or not the JFK Marilyn relationship was real or fake or not, that whole dynamic really did create the ultimate symbol of what I'm going to call the Madonna Complex. The Madonna Complex is kind of a shortened and social media friendly version of the Madonna Whore Complex, but that second word, not social media friendly. So I'm going to call it the Madonna Complex. But Jackie and Marilyn really did become kind of the epitome of the Madonna Complex. Again, whether or not Marilyn was actually the mistress or not, the Jackie Marilyn really did become sort of the symbol of that. And I've gone into the Madonna Complex in a lot of other videos. I touched on this a lot in my Beyonce Jay-Z video, and I do feel like there were a lot of people that misunderstood what I was talking about a little bit, and I want to dive into this a little bit. So the Madonna Complex essentially is kind of like the wife mistress categories that men tend to put women into. Now the reality is that if we're looking at feminine energy and the feminine archetypes, and I have a lot of videos about the feminine archetypes, is as women, as feminine beings, we contain all of the feminine archetypes. All the different feminine archetypes that exist, whether it be sort of, you know, the wife, which could be considered the maiden, the mother, the queen, so to speak, or the mistress, which would tend to be like the lover archetype or things like that. All of those archetypes are within us. And then you can put all the archetypes into light feminine archetypes and your dark feminine archetypes. I actually have a video about the dark feminine archetypes, as well as a guided journal about the dark feminine archetypes that will help you connect to that. So there's the light feminine and the dark feminine. You could kind of argue that the wife would be kind of representative of the light feminine, and the mistress could be kind of representative of the dark feminine. I mean, that's simplifying it. It's more complex than that, but like in general terms, in many cases, actually in today's society, the wife archetype, I would say, or like the Jackie archetype, is often quite masculine. In fact, as I've talked about in other videos, like trad wives in general tend to be quite masculine. They have kind of the stereotypes of femininity in the sense that they oftentimes wear wear pretty dresses, and they oftentimes, you know, cook and clean and have babies and take care of their families, but they tend to approach those things from a very masculine place. Jackie Kennedy was very much known for her physical discipline. She also was known for being very disciplined about what she ate because she didn't want to gain weight, because she had to look a certain weight. It's actually been known that Jackie was very much, I guess, what you would call an almond mom today with her daughter, because, you know, she had the message that boys don't like girls that put on weight. Like, that was the message. That kind of like very restrictive eating, that discipline, I would say kind of like that almond mom stereotype, very masculine. Very restrictive eating is very masculine. Overeating, overindulging in food to the point where it's destructive to your health and your body, that's wounded feminine energy. I know that I get a lot of people that have some kind of misunderstandings about that in general. Restrictive eating, things like anorexia and those kind of like really rigid to the point of disordered eating disorders are very masculine. Overindulging, binge eating, overindulging in food to the point of it being destructive and damaging to your health, that's wounded feminine energy. And I'm getting on a whole food tangent here, which isn't the point of the video, but like eating for nutritional value, like just eating for nutrition, usually very plain, very bland, that's masculine behavior. Eating for pleasure is very feminine. We all have both energies within us, masculine and feminine. But generally speaking, if you're embodying your masculine energy, like a healthy masculine energy, you're going to like see food as fuel. Whereas if you're eating from a feminine place and a healthy feminine place, you're going to eat food for pleasure. When it starts to get overindulgent to the point where you get into like binge eating, or it starts to get to be really unhealthy, that's wounded feminine. When it starts to get into really like restrictive behavior or starvation or eating disorders that tend to be overly restrictive, or starvation or something, that tends to be wounded masculine, just for clarification. So a lot of the sort of like Jackie Kennedy or the trad wife or the kind of like stereotypes of like wife behavior in our society do tend to be somewhat masculine. Men expect them to be very disciplined. They expect them to be their peace. That's masculine behavior. Feminine energy is no man's peace at all. Whereas when we're talking about the mistress archetype, and if we're talking about the stereotypical like Marilyn Monroe stereotype of the mistress archetype, a lot of what, I know Marilyn is a very complex character and a lot of people have a lot of theories around her and stuff, but generally speaking, Marilyn Monroe was very wounded feminine. You know, she had a lot of addiction problems and things like that. She did struggle with maintaining her weight a lot throughout her career because of a lot of addictive behaviors. She was very promiscuous throughout her career. She had a lot of depression issues. Like, Marilyn Monroe had a lot of wounded feminine energy like around her, and I don't say this as a judgment because a lot of people do, and you know, she had a very difficult upbringing and things like that, and you know, obviously with all of the pressures of the industry and the way she was treated in the industry and things like that, like I'm not saying that as like a knock on her or anything. It's just she was very wounded feminine. So oftentimes stereotype in our current society of kind of like the wife mistress tends to be kind of like this sort of like rigid, disciplined masculine in the wife, and this kind of wounded feminine, destructive woman in the mistress, so to speak. Like, that's kind of what the Jackie Marilyn dichotomy tends to be. The wife and mistress archetypes can come in a very healthy sense, but generally speaking, the way that they're limited in our society, they tend to not be very healthy. So one of the things that I see, and one of the like the pushbacks I get when I talk about things that like what men are looking for, and I always say, I know I get a lot of men who don't like that I say this, but I always say this: never listen to what men say. And that doesn't mean that you should like never actually listen to the words that come out of their mouth. But when it comes to what men want in a woman, never listen to what they say. Never ask a man what he wants in a woman. Never. Never ask him that, because you're never going to get the true answer that comes out of his mouth. You have to watch his actions, because men can say all day, and you hear it online all the time, they want a woman who's natural. They want a woman who's natural with a low body count, and not a woman who's promiscuous, and not a woman who wears too much makeup, and not a woman who's materialistic, and like they can say that all day. Except that women who have all of the work done, and I mean obvious work done, I'm not talking about women who just maybe had a little tweak here and there and the guy can't tell, but like obviously, you know, plastic surgery and things like that. Women that are overly materialistic, the women that are very chaotic and not a man's piece, like all those kind of things, like those are the women that men give their time, money, and attention to. And guys love to say, oh, well, that's just for recreation, or that's what we're sexually attracted to. But the women we want to marry are actually the good girls that are not promiscuous, that are all natural and, you know, are my piece and things like that. But the problem is when men put women into those categories, the good girl, the bad girl, the wife and the mistress, that's never going to make for a healthy relationship, because for one, monogamy can't exist in that environment. When you have that split where as men you can only see women as either wife or mistress, you can't have a monogamous relationship because you can't get all of that from one person. And the reality is, all of those things that like anything a man could ever want in a woman exists in every woman. It's just a matter of how well she's tapped into that. And for some women, it's really hard for them to tap into all of those different archetypes within them. Some women it's easier. I mean, for some women, certain archetypes are easier than other archetypes. For some women, tapping into her like lover's sexual energy is way easier. And for some women, that's very difficult, and she's much more comfortable stepping into like her mother energy, where she feels much more nurturing and things like that, or like any of the other feminine archetypes. Generally speaking, as women, because of society, we tend to feel a little bit more comfortable in our own categories. But all of those archetypes, all of the feminine archetypes are within every woman. It's just a matter of whether or not we can tap into those. So that's why the concept of monogamy is not that crazy, because at the end of the day, everything a man could ever want in a woman exists in all women. It's just a matter of whether or not she can tap into that. But if men can only see one woman as like the wife and one woman as the mistress, he can't ever be in a monogamous relationship, because he can't ever get everything that he needs from one woman, because he's blocked off from that. And that's where you kind of get like the Jackie Marilyn dichotomy of like, oh, well, I can have this woman as the wife, but I'm gonna fantasize about this woman sexually, whether he acts on it or not. But he's never going to see his wife as a sexual being, because he's split that within his mind. So he's always going to be looking somewhere else for his sexual satisfaction. But yet, if he goes to the woman that he gets his sexual satisfaction from, he's never going to be able to commit to her in a relationship, because he just can't see her as a wife, because he has that split. So he's never going to be in a committed relationship and probably want to start a family and things like that with somebody who he only sees as a sexual being, even though that's what he desires sexually, and that's how you make a baby, is obviously sleeping with somebody. But you know, maybe he'll make a baby with her, but he won't see a relationship with her because he's so cut off from seeing her as a wife as well. In many ways, this split that men have in their minds about putting women in these categories of wife and mistress, like, they're not beneficial to men, because a man is never going to be able to be in a satisfying monogamous relationship as long as he keeps that split in his mind, because he's always going to be looking to other women to fulfill something in him that he's missing in the woman he sees. Even if she can bring that to him, he's going to be blocked from seeing it, because he just doesn't believe that he can get all of that from one woman. Now, as women, and I realize that there is a whole movement of women that are decentering men and are doing the 4B movement, where they don't want to be a part of relationships and things like that and whatever. I still encourage women, whether you want to have a relationship or you are like, I don't want a relationship, I'm done with men, or whatever. Honestly, even if you're, you know, only getting into relationships with women or whatever, I do still firmly believe that it's important for all women to learn to connect with all the feminine archetypes, because I think it's just better for us as women. I think we will have more fulfilling lives tapping into these things, whether we choose to be with a man or not. So like, I never tell women to tap into their feminine energy or connect with their feminine archetypes like for men, or to get a man, or to keep a man. I actually think it's just beneficial for women ourselves, whether you choose to be in a relationship or whether you don't. But if you are a woman who's desiring a relationship, it can get very confusing, because oftentimes men will say that they want, you know, a good woman who's his piece and who's all natural and things like that. But then those men always give all of their time, money, and attention to women who are the opposite. I mean, I stand by this as men. You can't keep doing that and giving all your time, money, and attention to women who are the OF girls or the strippers or the gold diggers or the whatever it is that you want to call them, and then be surprised when more and more women start acting like that, because you're literally rewarding that behavior. And you can sit there and say all day that you want a woman with a low body count, who's your piece, who's all natural. If there's no reward for that for women, that woman is, even if she becomes a wife, if she's going to be the overlooked wife who's just going to stay at home and do your laundry and birth your kids while you run around with all the women who are the opposite, like, no woman's going to want to sign up for that deal. She doesn't want to sign up to be just the woman that gets taken advantage of while the guy runs off and has all the fun with the woman who's not his piece, not natural, who is promiscuous and sleeping around. Like, if those women get rewarded, it's not shocking that more women are going to start acting like that, because nowadays just being a wife who sits at home and births babies and, you know, does laundry all the time, especially now when most women have to work as well. So like, being a wife is not even considered even a privilege at this point. It's literally a sacrifice, because you have to work full time and you have to take care of a whole family and stuff. Like being a wife isn't a prize anymore by any means. And again, women are always the prize, men are not the prize, but that's a whole other conversation. But when a guy will say something like, well, you know, I'd rather have like the good girl as my wife, it's like, well, okay, but you making someone your wife nowadays especially is not really considered a privilege. If you are going to spend all of your time, money, and attention on the women who are sort of like the bad girl, the mistress type, you know, your OF girls, your strippers, your Instagram models, or whatever, like if that's what you're going to spend all of your time, money, and attention on, well, of course women are going to see that as the way to go, because that's getting rewarded. And it's men that did that. Like, men can argue all day that, well, women did that. It's like, yeah, but you're the ones rewarding them to do that. I mean, that goes down a whole other rabbit hole that I could talk about for days, but I want to stick on this, like, the Madonna Complex thing. So again, when you're getting into like your Jackie, Marilyn, Madonna Complex situation, I've brought this up in other videos, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's so important. There's a saying that I don't love because I don't love what it implies, but I think there's some truth in it, that a man should treat his wife like his mistress and his mistress like his wife. And the reason for that is because the wife knows she's a wife, but generally speaking, women don't want to just be the wife that does the cooking and the cleaning and the, you know, the birthing of the babies and stuff, and like isn't desired sexually. So like, typically the woman that's in that wife role also wants to know that a man desires her sexually, that sees her as a beautiful, desirable human being. Like, that's usually what wives crave. For men, if you treat your wife kind of like your mistress, she still feels like, she knows she's the wife. But if she also feels like she's desired sexually, she's gonna be more responsive to you. Like, she's gonna be more open to having a sexual relationship with you because she's feeling desired sexually. The mistress, so to speak, although mistresses don't always know that they're the mistress, it depends on how much she knows about what the situation is, but the mistress typically knows she's not the wife because she knows she's not married. But usually women in that situation, like, guys tend to have to pretend that they want a relationship with her. That's when they get into the whole, oh, my wife doesn't understand me, you're the one that I really want, and blah, blah, blah. And oftentimes sells the mistress on that he wants a relationship with her because the mistress isn't stable in that, like, knowing that there's a commitment there. But she knows she's desired sexually because that's what the man shows up for. What that indicates is that women want to be both. Women want to be both wife and mistress. No woman wants to sign up to just be a wife, to have a guy who's just spending his time fantasizing about other women and wanting to sleep with other women and wanting to be with other women, or even actually sleeping with other women. Like, women don't sign up for that deal. Like, that's a terrible deal for her. Women want to know that they're still desired physically as much as they want the relationship and the commitment. Whereas like the mistress, so to speak, like the woman who might be more promiscuous, tends to desire somebody who will commit to her and will give them the stability of a relationship. I'm not encouraging promiscuity, generally speaking. I think a lot of that can be fears around intimacy or things like that. But generally speaking, typically women want to feel like the man that desires them sexually also wants to make a commitment. Obviously, there's some reasons why she might not want that. There can be, you know, intimacy fears and things like that that go on. But generally speaking, I mean, they've done a lot of studies that show, first of all, that, you know, most women don't have satisfactory one-night stands. They also have a lot of studies that show that most women are horribly unsuccessful at like situationships or friends with benefits or things like that, because most women will eventually catch feelings for a guy the more she's sexually intimate with him. There are circumstances where that doesn't happen, but generally speaking, that's the most common. So generally speaking, like most women that get into these like situationships or promiscuous or sleeping around, like generally speaking, there's a deep desire in them to like be chosen, to have someone want to commit to them. Sometimes they have blockages to that. And again, I'm not saying that a man has to commit to somebody who is promiscuous or anything like that. Like, that's your own personal choice. But again, there's a deep desire in women to be both wife and mistress, to be the Jackie and the Marilyn, to be the woman that a man wants to make that commitment to, that will see as like a wife and a life partner, but also is the one that he desires sexually. Women need both. Women need a man to show up and see her as both. Women are not going to be satisfied just being either the wife or just the mistress. They're not going to be satisfied just being put in that one category. It's never going to become a satisfying relationship for her. And in reality, it's not going to be a satisfying relationship for men either, because a man's basically going to have to make the decision that he either needs to cut one part of his life off. He either needs to like never be in a fully committed relationship and just keep sleeping around with multiple women, which, as much as a lot of guys think that that sounds like a good deal, overwhelmingly, those are not the most successful men. Overwhelmingly, when men actually commit to a woman in marriage, men are much more successful at life. Or he ends up committing to the woman and being in a relationship, but he ends up either feeling like he has to cheat, or he is constantly looking around for something sexual because he feels like now that he's made this commitment, he only sees this woman as a wife, and he doesn't get to have the fulfilling sexual relationship. And I realize that there are cases where if the woman is sort of put in the wife category, that they will still have a sexual relationship, but generally speaking, in most of those cases, the woman never really truly feels like she can fully tap into that, like her true sexuality, because she usually feels like she has to hold back to not be seen as someone who's too promiscuous. Like oftentimes women who end up in the like wife category are also very cut off from their own sexuality for a lot of reasons, sometimes religious reasons or societal reasons or something like that. So they might show up and have a sexual relationship with their partner, but generally speaking, they're going to be cut off from really tapping into their true sexuality. And when men put women into like the wife category, oftentimes it's usually when they end up like fantasizing about the other woman, because they might go through the motions of sleeping with their wife, but like generally speaking, they're not going to tap into like their true sexual desires because they've put her in the wife category. So like even if you do have two people that just make the commitment together to like, okay, well, I put her in the wife category, I'm going to wife her up, but like I still don't see her as a sexual being because I can't see the wife as also my sexual partner. Two people, they might go through the motions and sleep together so they can have kids or things like that, but they're not going to truly have a fulfilling sexual relationship until they're able to show up as both. Men absolutely have to work on this mentality themselves. If a man can't see a woman as both wife and mistress, if he has to put women into those categories, he's never going to have a fulfilling relationship, and he's going to have to work on that. And honestly, when it comes to work like that, men have to do that on their own. They have to do that work with themselves and other men. Women can't do that work for them. That said, if you're a woman that truly desires to be in a relationship with a man, and you truly want a man to see you as both like the wife that he commits to and the woman he desires sexually, you have to be able to tap into both of those sides of yourself. So if you're someone who is very comfortable in sort of like wife mode, but you've completely cut off from your sexuality for whatever reason, it could be religious reasons or societal reasons or, you know, slut shaming or whatever it is, if you can't tap into your sexuality, you really can't expect a man to be able to see that or find that in you, because you've blocked yourself off from that. You need to be able to tap into that first yourself before any man's ever going to really see that in you. He should be able to once you tap into that, and if he can't, that's on him. But you're going to need to be able to tap into that yourself. If you're a woman who only puts yourself in kind of the mistress category, maybe you're very promiscuous, you wear that as a badge of honor, but you're secretly desiring that you want a commitment and you want a true partnership, you're going to have to learn to tap into that part of yourself that isn't just led by your sexuality. And you're going to have to explore other parts of yourself. Doesn't mean you can't own your sexuality, but you're going to have to learn to tap into the parts of yourself that are more than just your sexuality, because if you as a woman lead with your sexuality and that's all you bring to the world, people aren't going to see you as more than that. Should they see you as more than that? Probably yes, but they're not going to, because you haven't tapped into that part of yourself. So I'm not telling women that are, you know, very comfortable in their sexuality to cut that part of themselves off. However, it's also important for you to learn to tap into other parts of yourself and not just show up with sexuality. Because in the same way that we tell men that like if you just show up with money, a woman's only going to want you you for your money because that's all you've shown up as. In that same way, if you're a woman who only shows up with her sexuality, you can't argue that men are only using you for your sexuality because that's all you've shown up as. Now, that doesn't mean that, like, you know, if you're a man with money and you do have other things to offer and you are showing up with other things, it doesn't mean that someone might not use you for your money, and that's where you have to use discernment. And in the same way, if you're a woman who embraces her sexuality but she also has a lot more that she's bringing to the world, it doesn't mean that people aren't going to try to use you for your sexuality. I mean, there's always going to be people in the world like that, right, that just want to use you for what they can get, and that's where you have to use your discernment and things like that. But if you are only showing up in the world with one thing, you can't really get upset if somebody is just only sees you for that one thing or is just using you for that one thing because you haven't tapped into more than that. I know I kind of got off track on the Jackie and Marilyn thing, but I do think that you really can't have a discussion about JFK and Jackie without kind of touching on like the Jackie Marilyn dynamic. And it does really feel like JFK and Jackie were very much a marriage of like political convenience. It doesn't mean that they didn't actually care about each other, but generally speaking, it does look like, you know, Jackie was the epitome of a wife. I mean, I think she might be even the most iconic first lady that we've ever had. She's what so many first ladies now kind of look to. She did a great job. Like, she was very much a big part of what made JFK more appealing. And in the documentaries I watched of her, like, she really did so much for his campaign and really did bring a certain quality to his campaign that really did help him get to where he was. I posed a question actually in my video about the Obamas, about how I actually speculated whether or not, if JFK had not been assassinated and he had actually continued out his presidency, you know, if him and Jackie would have stayed together long term had he lived. You know, there's speculation to that. I mean, we all know he was philandering and Jackie was kind of looking the other way. You know, these things have a way of catching up with themselves. I feel like back then it was a little bit easier to kind of keep that stuff under wraps. So if it did get more public and it did start to become much more publicly humiliating for Jackie, would she have walked away? It's hard to know. I mean, they were Catholic, and back then, you know, in the Catholic Church, getting divorced was very, very scandalous. Jackie was the product of divorce. Her parents were divorced and she did not take that very well, so it's possible she would have stuck it out because she didn't want to repeat the pattern of her parents. I don't know, it's possible. You know, Jackie became very progressive as her life went on, so, you know, maybe she would have decided she wanted to be more independent. And when she ended up with Onassis, who was her second husband, he was an older man and he had a lot of money, and in that time period, money meant security. A lot of rumors swirled that Jackie and Onassis' relationship was not very good. But, you know, there was a time period where for women, especially if you were used to a certain lifestyle as a woman, a man with money equaled security. Nowadays, yes, money still equals security. Money is still important. To pretend that how much money a man has is irrelevant is actually insane to me. Like, the fact that we think that way, because money literally is tied to our safety and security. It absolutely is. That said, money is not the only thing that determines safety and security. A man can have a ton of money nowadays, but if he doesn't feel like a safe and stable man, I stand by the fact that I've known a lot of men that have had a lot of money that ended up doing a lot of damage with that money. Like, if somebody has like an addiction problem or things like that, they can do a lot of damage when they have access to too much money. I mean, that's a whole other video and a whole other tangent. I do actually have a video on spending addiction and things like that dives into that a little bit more. It's not totally shocking that Jackie, after going through tragedy and things like that, like a big theme in a lot of the documentaries I watched is that, you know, I mean, Jackie was there when her husband got assassinated. I mean, she was literally right next to him. And back then they did not have treatments for PTSD and things like that, and that she showed a lot of signs of PTSD and stuff, which I don't think that you could argue at all that it wouldn't be completely understandable for her to have. She also had a lot of really problem pregnancies. She had miscarriages and stuff. I'm sure that Jackie had a lot of mental health issues she was dealing with. And back in those days, women really did have to deal with those things on their own. I know we tend to focus a little bit more on, like, there's no mental health access for men and things like that. And we could have more mental health access for men. We absolutely could in our society. I agree with that. I think there is more mental health access for men now than men want to admit to. I think a lot of men just like the idea of complaining about how there's not mental health access, so they don't have to take the steps to get it. I think there is more mental health access now for men than there ever has been. I think a lot of men just need to take the step to actually seek it out and actually, you know, take the steps to heal. But, you know, mental health access for women was not very common, you know, up until very recently. And is there more help for women in the mental health space? Probably. but generally speaking, that's a pretty new development. So actually having access to mental health for people, and honestly, I would still say that the system we have now for helping people with mental health issues could also use a lot of work. So I think there's a long way to go. But I know this wasn't really totally an analysis of JFK and Jackie, generally speaking, but after watching the documentaries, I really felt like this, you know, the generational trauma of like Jackie basically kind of following in, you know, her family ancestral trauma of like ending up with a philanderer like her father and sort of like just seeking out a man with money that could be security for her was definitely a pattern for her, which is so common, but it's a shame. And I do think there are more people that are healing from ancestral trauma now than there ever have been, but I do still think we have a long way to go because we normalize a lot of bad behavior, particularly bad behavior in men, and that behavior just tends to, it's harder to spot red flags when red flag behavior is normalized in our society, and I think that that's really important. It's one of the reasons why I try to teach women about spotting red flags, because there's so much red flag behavior that is just totally normalized in our society that we may not even know are red flags. I had a conversation with my mom even, who's kind of like a little bit more in like the JFK Jackie generation, so to speak, and I remember saying something to my mom about red flags, and she was like, oh, in my day we didn't have red flags. And I was like, no, you did. You just didn't know how to spot them back then, because back then women had to choose men for certain reasons that, you know, were for survival, but they weren't necessarily the best men. They were just men that could provide for them, and they didn't expect men to be more than just financial providers. And nowadays women expect more from men, and I think that's a good thing. I absolutely do. The problem is that a lot of men aren't stepping up, and unfortunately too many men are not taking the steps themselves to learn how to step up. Yeah, and then as far as like the Madonna Complex, I just think that this putting women in categories and this limiting belief around the Jackie Marilyn dynamic, or just putting women in the wife mistress category, I mean, and I think it gets even more destructive because I actually took a quiz one time, I remember, that was just like, are you a Jackie or a Marilyn? And like my personality is actually much more Jackie, but like clearly my body is more Marilyn, my physical look being more voluptuous. It's one of those things where oftentimes I would get men that would assume that I was much more sexual than I actually was, or that I was showing up as more of like a mistress type, when in reality my personality is actually much more of like a Jackie type of a person, you know, as far as my sort of mindset. In reality, I think, you know, like I said before, Jackie mindset tends to get a little bit more masculine, and the Marilyn mindset tends to get a little bit more wounded feminine, and probably in reality the healthy place is somewhere in the middle. But oftentimes women get categorized just based on their physical appearance, whether it actually matches who they are as a person or things like that. They tend to get put into these categories. And if you're a woman who's, say, you know, well endowed, you tend to get automatically put in the mistress category, even if you aren't necessarily, you know. And I think that, you know, that's a detriment, because that doesn't even have anything to do, I mean, that's genetics. It doesn't even have anything to do necessarily with, you know, who you are as a person. Putting women in categories is just so dangerous, and women do it to ourselves. We absolutely put ourselves into categories. We put other women into categories. This isn't just a man thing. Men do this for sure, and I think that's the stereotype, but I do think that women put ourselves into categories. We put other women into categories, and I just think it's a detriment to all of us as women. And I really highly encourage women to learn to tap into your feminine energy, but all the feminine archetypes, and to not just fit yourself into like a little box of what you think like femininity is, or, you know, what it means to be feminine, or to just put yourself into a specific, like, you know, good girl, bad girl, wife, mistress category or something. Because at the end of the day, as women, we're going to be more satisfied just in our own lives, whether we're in a relationship or not. We're going to be more satisfied in our lives if we really learn to tap into all of those things. So I have videos on YouTube going into the feminine archetypes. I also have a video about the dark feminine archetype, and I have the dark feminine energy guided journal that can help you tap into the dark feminine archetypes. Light feminine archetypes are great. I think that they're a little bit more accepted in our society today, whereas the dark feminine archetypes are a little bit more taboo, and frankly I think they're more fun to tap into, if I'm being totally honest. And if you find yourself really getting into some of these patterns and these archetypes and things like that, or categorizing yourself and kind of getting into some like pick-me behavior, which can really come from, you know, a lot of parental wounds and things like that, I have the Recovering Pick-Me Girl guided journal that can really help you tap into that, because there's a lot of pick-me behavior that may not be like super obvious to women, but like it's kind of deeply ingrained in us. And I do actually have chapters in that book about like mother wounds and father wounds if you want to dive into that. So my guided journals are available on Amazon. Details are in the description box below, so you can check those out, along with some courses, masterclasses, and all my social media links. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. If you have any thoughts on this video or any other video requests or anything, let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. And honestly, any engagement on this channel actually really does boost everything in the algorithm so that more people can get this message. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.